The November wind cut through my black dress like a blade as I stood beside the freshly dug grave in Willow Creek Cemetery. My father's mahogany casket sat suspended over the earth, and the only sounds were the preacher's hurried words and the soft snorting of Thunder, Dad's 20-year-old quarter horse, who had somehow broken free from his paddock. I had expected my brothers, my aunts, maybe even some of the neighbors who had known Samuel Carter for over 60 years. Instead, it was just me, Sarah Carter Williams, a divorced 34-year-old who had driven 8 hours from Denver to bury the man who raised me alone after Mom died. The empty folding chairs seemed to mock my grief, their metal frames glinting in the pale afternoon sun like accusations. Thunder pawed at the ground behind me, his coat thick with winter fur, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. He had been Dad's constant companion since I was 14, working cattle, clearing brush, and standing patient through countless storms both literal and metaphorical. Now, as Pastor Mackenzie closed his worn Bible and offered me his condolences, the old horse stepped closer to the grave, lowering his massive head as if he understood what was happening. I reached out to touch his neck, feeling the familiar warmth that had comforted me through so many childhood fears. In that moment, I realized that Thunder wasn't just mourning my father. He was the only other soul on earth who truly knew the man Samuel Carter had been. The funeral director cleared his throat and gestured toward the casket, waiting for my signal to begin the lowering. I nodded, my throat tight with unshed tears, and watched as the mechanical were filled the silence. Thunder whinnied softly, a sound so human-like in its sorrow that it broke something inside me that had been holding firm since I received the call 3 days ago. As the casket disappeared into the earth, I made a silent promise to my father and to the horse who had loved him. I would uncover the truth about why Samuel Carter, a man who had helped birth half the foals in the county and never missed a church potluck, had died alone and unmourned. Something wasn't right, and Thunder seemed to know it too. Walking back through the ranch house felt like stepping into a museum of my childhood, every creaking floorboard and faded photograph telling stories I had tried to forget. The kitchen still smelled like coffee and leather, Dad's favorite mug sitting unwashed in the sink as if he might return any moment to finish his morning ritual. I found his reading glasses folded on top of yesterday's newspaper, the crossword puzzle half completed in his careful handwriting. The silence was oppressive, broken only by Thunder's hooves on the front porch as he followed me like a faithful dog. I had forgotten how he used to do that when I was young, shadowing me around the property as if appointed as my personal guardian. Now, it seemed he had transferred that protective instinct to watching over Dad's memory. The living room held 20 years of dust motes dancing in the afternoon light streaming through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned since Mom died. Dad's recliner sat at an angle facing the television, a Western novel splayed open on the armrest at page 237. I picked up the book and read the paragraph he had marked with his thumb. It was about a cowboy saying goodbye to his horse before heading into a dangerous canyon. The irony wasn't lost on me, and I wondered if Dad had known somehow that his time was coming. Thunder pressed his nose against the screen door, leaving a wet mark on the metal mesh, his dark eyes watching my every movement. There was an intelligence in his gaze that I had never noticed as a child, a knowing look that suggested he understood far more than any horse should. I made my way to Dad's bedroom, each step heavy with the weight of memories I wasn't ready to confront. His bed was neatly made with the same blue quilt Mom had sewn before her cancer diagnosis, the corners tucked with military precision despite Dad never serving in the armed forces. On his nightstand sat a photograph of our family from 1995. Mom, Dad, my 2 older brothers Jake and Matt, and me at age 10, all of us grinning beside Thunder when he was just a yearling. We looked happy then, before life began chipping away at our foundation piece by piece. The photo was surrounded by a collection of prescription bottles, more than I remembered Dad ever needing, and I made a mental note to ask Dr. Harrison about his final months. Something about the sheer number of medications seemed excessive for a man who had always prided himself on his health. In the closet, Dad's clothes hung in perfect order. Work shirts on the left, Sunday best on the right, boots lined up beneath like soldiers awaiting inspection. I reached for his favorite flannel, the red and black checked one he wore on cool mornings when he fed the horses, and brought it to my face. It still carried his scent of old spice and hay, and for a moment I could almost feel his arms around me the way they had been when I was small and afraid of thunderstorms. Thunder whinnied from the porch, a long, mournful sound that seemed to echo my own grief. I tucked the shirt under my arm and went back outside, finding the horse standing at the edge of the steps, his head lowered as if in prayer. Together, we watched the sun begin its descent behind the oak trees that marked the western boundary of the property Dad had worked for 40 years. The barn called to me as darkness approached, its familiar smells of leather and grain offering a comfort the house couldn't provide. Thunder followed without being asked, his hooves echoing in the empty stalls where 5 other horses had once lived. Dad had sold them all over the past 2 years, citing his age and declining strength, but I wondered now if there had been another reason. The feed room was nearly empty, just a few bags of oats and some moldy hay that should have been replaced months ago. In Dad's office, a cramped space carved from what used to be a tack room, I found stacks of unpaid bills and several angry letters from the bank. My heart sank as I realized the full scope of what I was inheriting. Not just grief and memories, but debt and responsibility I wasn't prepared to handle. Thunder stood in the doorway watching me, his presence both comforting and accusatory, as if he knew I had abandoned Dad when he needed me most. The financial documents told a story I hadn't expected. Medical bills dating back 3 years, a second mortgage on the property, and credit card statements showing charges for expensive treatments in Denver and Colorado Springs. Dad had been sick far longer than he had let on, fighting battles I knew nothing about while I was busy with my own divorce and career struggles. A letter from an oncology clinic made my blood run cold. The appointment date was just 2 weeks before he died, and the treatment plan outlined aggressive chemotherapy for pancreatic cancer. He had been dying alone, making impossible choices about his care and his future, and I had been too self-absorbed to notice the subtle changes in his voice during our monthly phone calls. Thunder nudged my shoulder with his nose, a gentle gesture that seemed to offer forgiveness I didn't deserve. As I sat in Dad's chair, surrounded by the evidence of his hidden suffering, I began to understand why no one had come to the funeral. He had pushed everyone away, protecting his pride and his privacy even as his body betrayed him. The neighbors who would have rallied to help had been kept at arm's length by a man too stubborn to admit weakness. My brothers, busy with their own families and problems, had probably tried to reach out only to be rebuffed by Dad's insistence that he was fine. I was the only one who had persisted, calling every few weeks out of duty rather than genuine concern, and even I had failed to read between the lines of his increasingly brief conversations. Thunder remained beside me as I cried for the first time since receiving the news. His warm breath on my neck, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone in this inherited sorrow. The evening brought a cold that seemed to seep into my bones, and I realized I would need to stay at the ranch tonight rather than drive back to the motel in town. Thunder followed me to the house, and I didn't have the heart to make him return to the pasture alone. I opened the back door and let him into the mudroom, where he had often waited during childhood storms, his presence filling the small space like a living security blanket. As I heated a can of soup Dad had left in the pantry, I wondered what I was going to do with a horse I couldn't afford to keep on a property I couldn't afford to maintain. But looking at Thunder's trusting eyes, I knew that abandoning him would be like abandoning the last piece of my father's heart still beating in this world. Dawn came too early, filtered through kitchen curtains that Mom had sewn decades ago, casting everything in a golden hue that made the ranch feel almost magical again. Thunder had spent the night in the mudroom, and I found him standing patiently by the back door, waiting for his morning routine that would never be the same. I fumbled through Dad's morning ritual, finding the feed bucket and measuring out oats the way I remembered from childhood visits. The other horses were long gone, sold to pay bills I was only beginning to understand, but Thunder accepted his solitary breakfast with the dignity of an old gentleman who had seen better days. As he ate, I noticed how thin he had become, his ribs visible beneath his winter coat, and I wondered if Dad had been rationing feed to save money during his final months. The mailbox at the end of the long gravel driveway held 3 days' worth of accumulated mail, and I trudged through the frost-covered grass to retrieve it, Thunder following at a respectful distance. Among the usual collection of catalogs and bills, I found a hand-delivered envelope with no postmark, just my father's name written in shaky handwriting across cream-colored paper. Inside was a note from Eleanor Hutchins, our nearest neighbor, expressing her sorrow at Dad's passing and her regret that she couldn't attend the funeral due to her own health problems. She mentioned that she had tried to visit Dad several times in recent months but had been turned away, and she hoped I would stop by so she could share some things she thought I should know. The tone of the letter suggested there were secrets lurking beneath the surface of my father's final year, and I felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. Eleanor's farmhouse sat just 2 miles down the county road, a modest white structure with green shutters that had weathered decades of Colorado seasons. Thunder and I made the walk together, he occasionally stopping to investigate interesting scents while I wrestled with questions about what I might learn. Eleanor answered the door before I could knock, as if she had been watching for my arrival from her kitchen window. She was friendlier than I remembered from childhood, her silver hair thin and her movements careful, but her eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had always made her seem formidable. She invited me in for coffee and positioned herself across from me at her worn oak table, Thunder visible through the window as he grazed in her front yard like he owned the place. "Your daddy was a proud man, Sarah, maybe too proud for his own good," Eleanor began, her voice carrying the weight of hard truths. She told me about the nights she had seen lights on in our barn until dawn, Dad working on something he wouldn't discuss with anyone. There had been visits from men in expensive cars, strangers who didn't belong in our rural community, and hushed conversations that ended whenever anyone else approached. In the months before his death, Dad had stopped attending church, stopped participating in the community events that had once defined his social calendar, and had become increasingly paranoid about people coming onto his property. Eleanor had attributed it to his illness, but now she wondered if there had been something more sinister happening on the ranch I thought I knew so well. The most disturbing revelation came when Eleanor showed me a photograph she had taken from her kitchen window 3 weeks before Dad died. In the grainy image, I could see 2 men in dark suits standing beside Dad near our barn, one of them holding what appeared to be a briefcase. Dad looked smaller than usual, diminished somehow, and his body language suggested he was being threatened rather than conducting normal business. Eleanor had been too afraid to approach or call the sheriff, assuming Dad would handle whatever trouble he had gotten himself into. She handed me the photograph with trembling fingers, apologizing for not intervening, and I assured her that she had done nothing wrong while my mind raced with possibilities I didn't want to consider. Thunder's behavior that morning began to make more sense as Eleanor shared her observations about his role in Dad's final months. The horse had become increasingly protective, positioning himself between Dad and any visitors, nickering warnings when strangers approached the property. Eleanor had seen him standing guard outside the barn during those late-night work sessions, alert and tense in a way that suggested he sensed danger his human couldn't fully comprehend. She believed Thunder had been trying to protect Dad from whatever trouble he had gotten involved in, and his presence at the funeral might have been less about grief and more about a continued need to stand watch over his beloved master. The thought that Dad had been in some kind of danger, alone except for his faithful horse, made my chest tight with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. As I prepared to leave Eleanor's house, she pressed something into my hand. A small silver key she had found in her mailbox the morning after Dad died. There was no note, no explanation, just the key wrapped in tissue paper and placed where she would be sure to find it. Eleanor was convinced Dad had left it for her to give to me, a final message from beyond the grave that suggested he had anticipated his death and prepared for it. The key was old and worn, with the number 247 etched into its surface, but I had no idea what it might unlock. Thunder seemed to recognize it when I showed it to him, his ears pricking forward and his nostrils flaring as if the metal carried a familiar scent. Together we walked back toward the ranch, both of us carrying the weight of secrets that demanded investigation. The afternoon was spent searching every lock and container on the property, the mysterious key burning like a talisman in my pocket. Thunder followed me from building to building, his behavior growing more agitated as we approached the old root cellar behind the barn. I had forgotten about the underground storage space Dad had built during my childhood, designed to keep vegetables fresh and provide shelter during tornado warnings. The wooden doors were secured with a rusty padlock that looked original to the structure, and my heart pounded as I inserted Eleanor's key and felt it turn smoothly in the mechanism. Thunder pawed at the ground beside me, his agitation increasing as I lifted the heavy doors to reveal stone steps disappearing into darkness. The air that rose from the cellar carried scents of earth and metal, and something else I couldn't identify. Something that made Thunder back away from the opening with a nervous whinny that raised the hair on my arms. The beam of my phone's flashlight barely penetrated the shadows below, but I could see that the root cellar had been transformed into something far more complex than the simple storage space I remembered from childhood. Thunder refused to follow me down the stone steps, instead positioning himself at the entrance like a sentinel, his ears flat against his head and his eyes wide with what looked like fear. The underground chamber stretched much further than I had expected, with newer concrete walls extending beyond the original stone foundation, creating a space large enough to house whatever secret project had consumed Dad's final months. Electrical cables snaked along the ceiling, connected to batteries and equipment that hummed with residual power, and I realized that the mysterious late-night activities Eleanor had observed had been happening down here in this hidden workshop. Tables lined the walls, covered with tools and materials I didn't recognize. Precision instruments, small electronic devices, and stacks of documentation in languages I couldn't read. In the center of the space sat a large metal container, roughly the size of a coffin, with complex locking mechanisms and warning labels in multiple languages including English, Russian, and what appeared to be Arabic. My hands shook as I photographed everything with my phone, the implications of what I was seeing slowly sinking in despite my mind's resistance to accept them. Dad had been involved in something far beyond the simple ranching life I thought he led, and the visitors in expensive cars suddenly made terrible sense. Thunder's agitated whinnying from above reminded me that I wasn't alone in this discovery, and I wondered if he had known all along what lay beneath our family property. A filing cabinet in the corner yielded documents that made my blood run cold. Contracts written in technical language I barely understood, but with dollar amounts that dwarfed anything a cattle rancher should have been handling. There were references to delivery schedules and international buyers, payment confirmations from banks in countries I couldn't locate on a map, and most disturbing of all, medical records showing that Dad's cancer diagnosis had come nearly a year before the earliest documents in this collection. He had known he was dying when he accepted whatever deal these papers represented, and I began to understand that his illness might have made him desperate enough to agree to things he would never have considered in better health. The name, Kozlov Industries, appeared repeatedly throughout the paperwork, along with a Denver phone number that I memorized before photographing the documents. The metal container dominated my attention as I worked through the files, its presence both fascinating and terrifying in the artificial light of the underground chamber. The locking mechanism required 2 keys working simultaneously, and I had only found one, but I could see through a small window in the top that the container held something roughly cylindrical, about 2 feet long, nestled in custom-fitted foam padding. Warning stickers covered every surface, showing symbols for radiation hazard, toxic materials, and international shipping restrictions that suggested whatever was inside had traveled a very long way to reach our remote Colorado ranch. Thunder's nervous pacing above grew more pronounced, and I realized he might be sensing something I couldn't detect. Radiation, chemical residue, or simply the accumulated stress of months spent guarding this dangerous secret alongside my dying father. A laptop computer hidden beneath a canvas tarp powered up when I connected it to the electrical system, revealing a desktop filled with encrypted files and communication software I had never seen before. The browser history showed regular visits to websites dealing with international trade, nuclear materials, and anonymous banking systems that painted a picture of criminal activity I couldn't fully comprehend. Email folders contained correspondence with people using obvious pseudonyms, discussing products and delivery windows in language designed to conceal true meaning from casual observers. The most recent messages were from just days before Dad's death, with increasingly urgent demands for final delivery, and threats about consequences for delay, that suggested he had been under tremendous pressure in his final weeks. I printed everything I could before the battery warning appeared, knowing I needed professional help to understand what I had uncovered. The sound of approaching vehicles sent me scrambling up the cellar steps, Thunder's alarm call confirming that we had company. I quickly secured the underground chamber and pocketed the key, trying to look casual as two black SUVs pulled into our driveway. The men who emerged wore the same type of dark suits Eleanor had described in her photograph, and their professional demeanor immediately identified them as federal agents rather than the local law enforcement I might have expected. Thunder positioned himself between me and the approaching strangers, his body language clearly protective despite his advanced age, and I was grateful for his presence as the lead agent introduced himself as Detective Morrison from a task force I had never heard of. His questions were polite but probing, focused on Dad's activities in recent months and whether he had left behind any materials or documents that might be of interest to ongoing investigations. I found myself lying with surprising ease, claiming ignorance about Dad's final months and expressing confusion about the questions they were asking. Thunder seemed to sense my deception and remained calm, his earlier agitation replaced by a watchful stillness that suggested he understood the gravity of our situation. The agents searched the property with practiced efficiency but superficially, missing the hidden entrance to the root cellar and finding nothing more suspicious than overdue bills and medical records. Before leaving, Detective Morrison handed me his card and suggested that I call immediately if I discovered anything unusual, his tone carrying a subtle threat that made it clear they would be monitoring the situation closely. As their vehicles disappeared down the gravel road, I realized that Dad's death might not have been as natural as I had assumed, and that Thunder and I were now guardians of secrets that people were willing to kill for. The evening brought no peace as I sat in Dad's kitchen, the weight of discovery pressing down on me like a physical burden. Thunder had returned to his position by the back door, but his alertness suggested he was still on guard against threats both known and unknown. I stared at Detective Morrison's business card, wondering if cooperation might be safer than the path I was considering, but something in his manner had suggested that federal involvement might not guarantee my protection or Thunder's safety. The documents hidden in the root cellar represented either evidence of my father's crimes or proof of his victimization, and until I understood which, I couldn't risk exposing them to authorities who might have their own agenda. Thunder's soft nickering seemed to encourage my caution, and I decided to spend another night at the ranch while I figured out my next move. Morning brought a revelation that changed everything I thought I knew about my father's final year. While searching through his bedroom more thoroughly, I discovered a hidden compartment behind a loose baseboard, containing a leather journal filled with Dad's careful handwriting. The entries began 14 months before his death, just after his cancer diagnosis, and told the story of a desperate man approached by criminals who promised to pay enough money to secure his daughter's future in exchange for temporary use of his isolated property. Dad had believed he was simply providing storage space for valuable but legally ambiguous imports, but as the months progressed, his journal revealed growing horror at what he had actually agreed to help transport. Thunder seemed to sense the importance of my discovery, positioning himself where he could see both the journal and the windows, maintaining his vigilant watch while I absorbed the truth about my father's impossible choice. The journal entries painted a picture of manipulation and coercion that made my heart ache for what Dad had endured alone. The men from Kozlov Industries had approached him through Dr. Harrison, who had apparently been feeding them information about terminal patients facing financial difficulties. They had presented themselves as international art dealers needing secure storage for pieces being moved discreetly between private collectors, and Dad's desperate need for money to cover his medical expenses and preserve the ranch for me had made him vulnerable to their deception. By the time he realized the true nature of what he was hiding, the criminals had made their threats clear. Cooperation meant financial security for his family, while exposure would result in consequences that extended far beyond his own life. Thunder's presence throughout those months had been his only comfort, the horse somehow understanding that his master was carrying an unbearable burden. The journal's final entries were the most disturbing, revealing that Dad had learned the truth about the container in his cellar just weeks before his death. The cylindrical object was not stolen art but weapons-grade nuclear material being smuggled to buyers whose identities and intentions Dad didn't want to imagine. His writing became increasingly frantic as he described attempts to contact federal authorities anonymously, only to discover that his communications were being monitored and his family was under surveillance. The men from Kozlov Industries had made it clear that any betrayal would result in Sarah's death, and Dad had chosen to take their secrets to his grave rather than risk my safety. The final entry, written just 3 days before he died, contained instructions for finding the journal and a plea for forgiveness for the legacy he was leaving behind. Thunder had been mentioned repeatedly throughout the entries as his protector and confidant, the only witness to his suffering who could be trusted completely. The phone number I had memorized from the underground documents led to a Denver office building that housed dozens of small businesses, creating perfect cover for illegal operations. I spent the afternoon conducting reconnaissance from my rental car, Thunder secured in a horse trailer I had found in Dad's barn, his presence offering comfort as I ventured into dangerous territory. The 7th floor housed Kozlov Industries behind an unremarkable door marked only with their name and suite number, and I watched from the parking garage as men in expensive suits came and went with the purposeful movements of people conducting serious business. A particularly chilling moment came when I recognized one of the men from Eleanor's photograph, confirming that these were the same people who had manipulated my father into becoming an unwilling accomplice in their criminal enterprise. Thunder's nervous stamping in the trailer seemed to echo my own anxiety as I realized the scope of what I was confronting. My plan formed slowly as I sat in that parking garage, weighing options that all seemed to lead toward danger for both Thunder and myself. The federal agents who had visited the ranch were either incompetent or corrupt, given their failure to discover what I had found so easily, and I couldn't risk trusting them with evidence that might disappear or be used to prosecute my father posthumously. The criminals from Kozlov Industries would eventually return to claim their property, and when they discovered the underground chamber empty, they would come looking for answers I wasn't prepared to provide. The only solution I could see involved using their own criminal network against them, but executing such a plan would require help from someone with experience in activities I had only seen in movies. Thunder's calm presence reminded me that Dad had faced impossible choices and made them with courage I was only beginning to understand. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A conversation with a parking garage attendant who recognized the men from Kozlov Industries and was eager to share information about their suspicious activities. Carlos Mendez was a former Marine who had been working security jobs since his discharge, and his military training had taught him to notice patterns that others might miss. He had been documenting the comings and goings from the 7th floor for months, suspecting them of illegal activities but lacking evidence to approach authorities he wasn't sure he could trust. When I showed him Eleanor's photograph and shared carefully edited details about my father's situation, Carlos immediately offered his assistance in exposing the criminal organization that had destroyed my family. His knowledge of surveillance techniques and his network of veteran contacts provided resources I hadn't dared hope for. Working with Carlos, I learned that Kozlov Industries was part of a larger network trafficking nuclear materials to terrorist organizations and rogue nations, using desperate property owners like my father as unwitting storage facilities across the rural West. The container in our root cellar was one of dozens moving through a pipeline that stretched from Eastern Europe to buyers in the Middle East and Asia, with Colorado serving as a crucial way station due to its remote properties and limited law enforcement presence. Dad had been selected not just for his financial desperation, but for his reputation as an honest man whose property would never be suspected of harboring such dangerous materials. The realization that his good name had been weaponized against him added another layer of tragedy to a story that seemed to grow darker with each revelation. Thunder's behavior during our surveillance activities convinced me that horses possessed senses we didn't fully understand. He could detect the approach of Kozlov operatives long before they became visible, his agitation serving as an early warning system that kept us from being discovered during our reconnaissance missions. When we returned to the ranch each evening, he would carefully inspect the property, checking locations that held particular significance in ways that suggested he understood the danger we were facing. His protective instincts had been honed during months of guarding Dad's terrible secret, and now he seemed determined to extend that protection to me as I followed the trail my father had been too frightened to pursue. Together, we were about to attempt something that would either expose a dangerous criminal network or get us both killed in the process. Carlos Mendez arrived at the ranch before dawn, driving a nondescript pickup truck that wouldn't attract attention in our rural community. Thunder greeted him with unusual friendliness, approaching the fence line where most horses would remain cautious around strangers, and I realized that animals possessed instincts about people that we often ignored to our detriment. Carlos had spent the night reviewing the documents I had photographed, using his military contacts to verify the authenticity of what we had discovered, and his grim expression told me that our situation was even more dangerous than I had imagined. The nuclear material in Dad's cellar was weapons-grade plutonium worth millions on the black market, part of a shipment that intelligence agencies had been tracking for over a year without success. Thunder seemed to sense the gravity of our conversation, positioning himself where he could observe both the approach to the ranch and Carlos's reactions to my revelations. The plan Carlos proposed was audacious in its simplicity. We would document everything in the underground chamber, create multiple copies of the evidence, and simultaneously release it to law enforcement agencies, journalists, and international organizations to prevent any single entity from suppressing the information. But first, we needed to secure the nuclear material itself, either by moving it to a safe location or ensuring it couldn't be retrieved by the criminals who would inevitably return for their property. Carlos had contacts in the military who could safely handle radioactive materials, but reaching them would require us to transport the container without proper equipment, a process that carried risks we could barely comprehend. Thunder's nervous pacing suggested he understood the danger we were discussing, and I wondered if Dad had wrestled with similar impossible choices during his final months. The morning was spent preparing for an operation that felt like something from a spy novel, rather than real life in rural Colorado. Carlos had brought equipment, radiation detectors, communication devices, and protective gear that looked military in origin, while I focused on Thunder's care and securing the ranch for what might be an extended absence. The horse seemed to understand that something significant was about to happen, following me more closely than usual and showing signs of the anxiety that had marked his behavior during Dad's final weeks. When I explained to him that we might need to leave the ranch for his safety, Thunder's intelligent eyes seemed to register understanding, and I was struck again by the depth of connection possible between humans and animals who had shared profound experiences. Carlos watched our interaction with respect, commenting that military working dogs showed similar bonds with their handlers in dangerous situations. The descent into the root cellar with proper lighting revealed details I had missed during my first exploration, including evidence that Dad had been forced to expand the chamber to accommodate additional materials beyond the single container I had discovered. Marks on the walls showed where shelving had been installed and removed, and scorch marks on the concrete suggested that some form of chemical processing had taken place in the underground space. Carlos's radiation detector began clicking ominously as we approached the metal container, confirming that we were dealing with materials dangerous enough to contaminate the entire area if mishandled. The lock mechanism was more sophisticated than it had appeared in darkness, requiring not just 2 keys but a specific sequence of operations that suggested the criminals had taken serious precautions to protect their investment. Thunder's agitated calls from above reminded us that time was running short before the Kozlov operatives returned to claim their property. The second key was hidden exactly where Dad's journal had indicated, inside Thunder's feed bucket, secured in a waterproof container that had protected it from the elements during the months since Dad's death. Thunder had been guarding not just the secret but the means to access it, carrying the burden of knowledge that his master had died protecting. As I retrieved the key, Thunder nuzzled my shoulder in a gesture that seemed to transfer responsibility from him to me, acknowledging that his long vigil was ending and mine was beginning. Carlos observed the interaction with the respect of someone who had seen the bonds forged between partners in dangerous circumstances, and I realized that Thunder had been more than my father's companion. He had been his partner in an operation that had cost Dad his life and might yet cost us ours. The container opened with mechanisms that clicked into place like pieces of a deadly puzzle, revealing the cylindrical object I had glimpsed through the window along with documentation that made Carlos curse under his breath. The nuclear material was packaged for transport to a specific location, coordinates that placed it in the Middle East, with delivery instructions that left no doubt about its intended use in terrorist activities. Dad had died carrying the knowledge that his desperate agreement had potentially enabled mass destruction, a burden that explained the haunted expression I had noticed during our final phone conversations. The documentation also revealed the scope of the trafficking network, with properties across 7 states serving as storage and processing facilities for materials that could power dozens of nuclear weapons. Thunder's increasingly frantic calls from above warned us that we were no longer alone on the property. The sound of approaching vehicles sent us scrambling to secure the evidence and escape the underground chamber before we could be trapped below ground. Carlos had prepared for this possibility, and we moved with practiced efficiency despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm my thinking. The container was too heavy and dangerous to move quickly, but we photographed everything and secured samples of the documentation before sealing the chamber and making our way toward the barn where Thunder waited with an urgency that suggested immediate danger. Through the barn's dusty windows, I could see 3 black SUVs surrounding the ranch house, disgorging men who moved with military precision toward predetermined positions. Thunder stood ready with the trailer Carlos had prepared, his body language indicating that he understood we were about to leave everything familiar behind in a desperate attempt to expose the truth Dad had died protecting. Our escape from the ranch felt like something from an action movie, with Thunder loading into the trailer with surprising calm while gunfire erupted behind us as Carlos's military friends provided covering fire from concealed positions. The horse that had spent months guarding deadly secrets was now fleeing with us toward an uncertain future, carrying in his calm presence the memory of my father's courage and the hope that his sacrifice might ultimately serve justice rather than enabling destruction. As we drove toward Denver with evidence that could topple an international criminal network, I realized that Thunder and I had become partners in a mission that had claimed my father's life and would likely change ours forever. The old horse had lost his first partner to the darkness we were fighting, but he seemed determined to see this battle through to whatever end awaited us in the days ahead. The safe house Carlos had arranged sat in an industrial district of Denver, surrounded by warehouses and legitimate businesses that provided perfect cover for the illegal activities we were now involved in by necessity rather than choice. Thunder adapted to his temporary stall with a resilience that had carried him through months of guarding dangerous secrets, though his alert posture suggested he remained ready for the next phase of whatever mission we were undertaking together. Carlos's military contacts had provided not just security but expertise in handling the evidence we had gathered, including specialists who could properly analyze the nuclear materials without risking contamination or exposure. The gravity of what we had uncovered was becoming clear as professionals examined Dad's documentation and confirmed that we had stumbled into the middle of the largest nuclear trafficking investigation in federal law enforcement history. Agent Sarah Martinez arrived at the safe house with credentials that impressed even Carlos's veteran contacts, representing a joint task force that had been tracking the Kozlov network for over 2 years without success. Her first question was about Thunder, whose presence she found both touching and strategically valuable given his intimate knowledge of the criminal operations activities at our ranch. Thunder seemed to recognize her genuine concern for his welfare, allowing her to approach and examine him for signs of radiation exposure, while she explained that several other properties had been identified as storage facilities but never successfully penetrated. Dad's forced cooperation had inadvertently provided law enforcement with their first detailed look inside the trafficking network, though the cost of that information had been his life and our family's destruction. Agent Martinez's respectful treatment of Thunder's role in our discoveries convinced me that we had finally found allies who understood the complexity of what we were facing. The full scope of the criminal network emerged during briefings that lasted through the night, with Thunder resting in his stall while I absorbed information that redefined everything I thought I knew about international crime. Kozlov Industries was a front organization for Russian intelligence services seeking to destabilize Western nations through terrorist attacks using smuggled nuclear materials, with American properties serving as the final staging areas before weapons reached their intended targets. Dad had been one of dozens of terminal cancer patients targeted for recruitment, their desperation and moral character making them ideal, unwilling accomplices who could be trusted to maintain secrecy under threat. The ranch I had inherited was part of a network stretching from Montana to New Mexico, with each property selected for its isolation and the vulnerability of its owners to financial coercion. Thunder's intelligence became a crucial asset as Agent Martinez realized that he could identify locations and individuals associated with the criminal operation through scent and behavior patterns developed during his months of exposure to the trafficking activities. The horse had essentially been conducting surveillance without realizing it, and his reactions to photographs of suspected operatives and locations provided confirmation of connections that law enforcement had been unable to establish through traditional investigative methods. His calm acceptance of the federal agents working around him suggested that he understood they were different from the criminals who had terrorized his final months with Dad, and I was amazed by his ability to distinguish between legitimate authority and criminal threat. Agent Martinez arranged for a veterinary specialist to examine Thunder for radiation exposure, concerned that his close proximity to the nuclear materials might have compromised his health in ways that wouldn't become apparent for months or years. The plan that emerged from our strategic sessions was both comprehensive and terrifying in its scope, requiring coordination between multiple federal agencies and international partners to simultaneously strike at all known facilities in the trafficking network. Thunder and I would return to the ranch as part of an elaborate deception designed to convince the Kozlov operatives that we had discovered nothing of significance, while electronic surveillance and undercover agents documented their activities and identified additional network members. The horse's presence would be crucial to the deception, as his behavior patterns had been observed by the criminals during their previous visits, and any significant change might alert them to law enforcement involvement. Carlos would remain at the ranch as my supposed romantic interest, providing security while maintaining the appearance of a normal relationship that would explain his presence and equipment to any watching criminals. The return journey to the ranch felt like traveling backward through time toward a confrontation that would either vindicate Dad's sacrifice or add our names to the casualty list of his impossible situation. Thunder's calm demeanor in the trailer suggested that he understood we were returning to dangerous territory, but his willingness to face that danger alongside me demonstrated the depth of loyalty that had sustained him through months of protecting deadly secrets. The familiar landscape of home looked different now, shadowed by knowledge of the criminal activities that had contaminated every acre with the potential for violence and destruction. As we approached the ranch, I realized that Thunder and I were about to become active participants in the kind of operation that had claimed my father's life, and that our survival would depend on our ability to maintain a deception that fooled some of the most dangerous criminals in the world. The ranch appeared undisturbed when we arrived, but Carlos's trained eye immediately spotted signs of recent surveillance that confirmed the Kozlov operatives were maintaining their interest in the property and its contents. Thunder's behavior upon returning to his familiar pasture was carefully monitored by hidden federal agents who had positioned themselves throughout the area, his reactions providing real-time intelligence about criminal activity that might not be detectable through electronic means. The horse seemed to understand that we were performing for an audience, maintaining his normal routines while remaining alert to dangers that could materialize without warning. His presence provided comfort and credibility to our deception, as anyone watching would expect him to be there as part of the ranch's normal operations, unaware that he had become a crucial asset in a federal investigation that could prevent nuclear terrorism on American soil. The first test of our deception came just 2 days after our return, when a familiar black SUV approached the ranch with occupants who had been photographed during Dad's final months of coercion. Thunder's immediate alertness confirmed their identity to the watching federal agents, while his controlled reaction suggested that he had been coached or had learned to mask his fear of these particular visitors. Carlos played his role as my boyfriend perfectly, engaging the strangers in casual conversation about ranch work and local weather while I maintained the appearance of a grieving daughter slowly adjusting to her inheritance. The visitors' questions were probing but carefully worded, designed to assess whether we had discovered anything unusual while cleaning out Dad's belongings, and their apparent satisfaction with our responses suggested that our deception was succeeding. Thunder's calm presence throughout the encounter provided the normalcy that made our performance believable, though I could see the tension in his posture that indicated he was ready to defend us if the situation deteriorated. The morning everything changed began like any other, with thunder nickering softly outside my bedroom window and the Colorado sun painting the mountains in shades of gold that reminded me why Dad had never wanted to leave this place. Carlos was checking the perimeter as part of our established routine, his military training making him invaluable as both protector and performance artist in the elaborate deception we had been maintaining for 3 weeks. Thunder's behavior had become our most reliable intelligence asset, his subtle changes in posture and attention alerting us to approaching danger long before human senses could detect threats. Agent Martinez had positioned herself and her team throughout the area with equipment that could monitor every conversation and movement within a 5-mile radius of the ranch, but all of our technological advantages meant nothing if Thunder detected something that made him bolt or behave in ways that would alert the criminals to our true situation. The call came through Carlos's encrypted radio at 6:47 a.m. Agent Martinez's voice tight with urgency as she reported multiple vehicles approaching from 3 directions in what appeared to be a coordinated assault on the ranch. Thunder was already moving toward the barn before any of us could see or hear the approaching threat. His instincts honed by months of living under constant surveillance and danger. Carlos immediately activated the emergency protocols that would summon federal backup, while simultaneously trying to maintain our cover story long enough to gather the evidence needed to prosecute the entire criminal network. The plan had always been to allow the Kozlov operatives to retrieve their nuclear materials while documenting every aspect of the operation, but the scale of their response suggested they suspected law enforcement involvement and were prepared for violent confrontation. Thunder's agitated circling of the barn indicated that he could sense the approaching storm and was trying to warn us that this encounter would be different from the carefully controlled meetings we had experienced previously. The first vehicles arrived with occupants who stepped out with military precision, their body language and equipment indicating professional training that went far beyond typical criminal activity. Thunder positioned himself between the barn and the approaching strangers, his protective instincts overriding years of learned caution around dangerous visitors, and I realized he was prepared to defend the secrets hidden beneath our property with his life if necessary. Carlos moved to intercept the lead operative while I maintained my position near the house, both of us wearing concealed communication devices that would allow federal agents to monitor every word of what promised to be a crucial confrontation. The tension was almost unbearable as we waited to see whether our deception would hold or whether the next few minutes would dissolve into the kind of violence that had claimed my father's life and might yet claim ours. The conversation began with the same polite inquiries we had encountered before, but the underlying tone was different. Harder, more insistent, with subtle threats that suggested our time for maintaining innocence was running out. The lead operative, who introduced himself as Mr. Volkov, asked specifically about our activities in the barn and whether we had discovered any unusual storage areas while cleaning up after Dad's death. Thunder's ears flattened against his head as Volkov spoke, a reaction so subtle that only someone who knew horses would recognize it as a sign of extreme agitation or fear. Carlos deflected the questions with practiced ease, but I could see tension building in both human and equine participants as the interrogation continued and the stakes became increasingly clear. When Volkov mentioned that they would need to conduct a thorough search of the property, Thunder actually stepped forward and positioned himself directly between the criminal and the barn, a gesture so protective and deliberate that it made my heart race with pride and terror in equal measure. The moment of truth came when Volkov produced a key identical to the one Eleanor had given me, revealing that the criminals had retained access to their storage facility and had been monitoring our activities more closely than we had realized. Thunder's reaction was immediate and dramatic. He reared up on his hind legs and struck out with his front hooves in a display of aggression I had never seen from him before, clearly recognizing the key and understanding its significance in ways that transcended normal animal intelligence. The criminal operatives drew weapons in response to Thunder's behavior, and I found myself screaming for them not to hurt him while Carlos tried to maintain our cover story despite the rapidly deteriorating situation. Agent Martinez's voice crackled through our concealed radios, ordering federal agents to close in as the situation spiraled beyond our ability to control through deception alone. The gunfight that erupted around the ranch lasted less than 10 minutes but felt like hours, with Thunder somehow understanding that he needed to stay low and behind cover while federal agents engaged the criminal operatives in a firefight that would either end the trafficking network or expose the full scope of their operation to retaliation. Carlos proved his military training by providing covering fire that allowed me to reach Thunder and guide him toward the safety of the stone barn, where we huddled together while automatic weapons fire shattered the peaceful morning air around Dad's beloved property. The horse that had spent months protecting deadly secrets was now experiencing the violent confrontation that those secrets had always threatened to unleash, and his calm acceptance of the chaos suggested that he had been expecting this moment throughout our elaborate deception. When the shooting finally stopped, Agent Martinez's voice on the radio confirmed that most of the criminal operatives were either dead or in custody, but Volkov had escaped and was likely rallying additional resources for a counterattack that would target anyone who had participated in disrupting their operation. The immediate aftermath of the firefight brought helicopters, medical teams, and enough federal agents to populate a small town, all converging on our remote ranch to process evidence and assess the damage to an operation that had taken years to develop. Thunder allowed the veterinary team to examine him for injuries, while I gave statements to investigators who were already planning the next phase of what had become an international incident with implications I was only beginning to understand. The nuclear materials had been secured, but the network responsible for trafficking them remained largely intact, and our participation in exposing their activities had made Thunder and me permanent targets for retaliation. Agent Martinez explained that we would need to enter witness protection immediately, leaving behind everything familiar in exchange for safety that could never be completely guaranteed against enemies with the resources and motivation of international criminal organizations. The ranch that had been in our family for 3 generations would become a federal crime scene, and Thunder would need to adapt to yet another upheaval in a life that had already been marked by more danger and uncertainty than any horse should experience. The federal facility where Thunder and I spent our first month in witness protection looked more like a resort than a safe house, with rolling pastures and modern stables that provided comfort while we adjusted to the reality of never returning to the life we had known. Thunder adapted to his new surroundings with remarkable resilience, though I could see in his eyes the same grief I felt for everything we had left behind in Colorado. Agent Martinez visited regularly to update us on the prosecution of the nuclear trafficking network, bringing news that our testimony had already led to arrests in 7 countries and the seizure of enough weapons-grade material to power dozens of nuclear devices. The horse that had once stood alone with me at Dad's funeral had become instrumental in preventing mass casualties that could have dwarfed any terrorist attack in modern history, though the cost of that contribution was the complete destruction of our former lives. Our new identities came with documentation that made us residents of Montana, where Thunder and I would supposedly inherit a small ranch from a fictional relative who had died under circumstances that explained our sudden appearance in the community. The federal marshals responsible for our protection had chosen the location carefully, selecting an area remote enough to provide security while offering the kind of rural lifestyle that would allow Thunder to live comfortably despite the artificial nature of our new existence. My new name was Rebecca Mitchell, and I would supposedly be recovering from a divorce while learning to manage agricultural property I had inherited unexpectedly. Thunder would simply be Thunder, since changing a horse's name would create behavioral complications that might attract unwanted attention from neighbors who would be watching for signs that we weren't who we claimed to be. The journey to our new home took 2 days, with Thunder traveling in a federal transport trailer that provided security and comfort during the transition between our old life and whatever future awaited us in witness protection. Carlos had volunteered to join us in the program, accepting a new identity as my romantic interest to provide both emotional support and additional security against threats that might emerge despite federal precautions. Thunder seemed to approve of Carlos's continued presence, having learned to trust him during the dangerous weeks when our deception had required perfect coordination to avoid detection by criminal operatives. The 3 of us had become a family forged by shared danger, and the prospect of starting over together in Montana felt like an opportunity for healing despite the artificial circumstances that would define our new existence. The ranch that became our new home sat in a valley surrounded by mountains that reminded me enough of Colorado to ease the homesickness that threatened to overwhelm my adjustment to witness protection. Thunder explored his new pasture with the careful attention of an animal who had learned that familiar places could hide deadly secrets, but his gradual relaxation suggested that he sensed no immediate threats in our new environment. The house was modest but comfortable, furnished with items that supported our cover story while providing the practical necessities for rural living that we had all grown to appreciate during our previous life. Carlos adapted to his role as ranch hand and romantic partner with the same professionalism he had brought to our federal operation, and I began to see possibilities for genuine happiness despite the circumstances that had brought us together. The community that welcomed us to Montana was small enough that newcomers attracted attention but large enough to provide anonymity if we maintained our cover story consistently. Thunder's presence helped establish our legitimacy as ranch owners, since horses required knowledge and commitment that casual pretenders couldn't maintain convincingly over time. The local veterinarian, Dr. Patricia Cole, immediately noticed Thunder's intelligence and training, commenting that he showed signs of having worked closely with humans in situations requiring trust and communication. I deflected her observations by crediting my fictional deceased relative with Thunder's excellent training, but her professional interest in his background reminded me that maintaining our deception would require constant vigilance against casual questions that could expose inconsistencies in our manufactured history. Our first real test came when neighboring ranchers invited us to participate in a community roundup, an annual event that would require Thunder and me to demonstrate riding skills that matched our supposed background in ranch management. Thunder rose to the occasion magnificently, working cattle with instincts that impressed even experienced cowboys who had been born to ranch life. His performance validated our cover story while providing genuine satisfaction as I realized that the bond forged through shared danger had made us better partners than we had ever been during peaceful times on Dad's ranch. Carlos proved equally capable in his assigned role, and by the end of the day, we had established ourselves as legitimate members of the community despite the artificial foundation of our presence there. The psychological adjustment to witness protection proved more challenging than the practical aspects of maintaining our new identities, as Thunder and I both struggled with grief for Dad and anger at the circumstances that had destroyed our previous life. Therapy sessions with federal counselors helped me process the trauma of discovering Dad's secrets and participating in the dangerous operation that had exposed the nuclear trafficking network. But Thunder's healing had to happen through patient attention to his emotional needs and gradual rebuilding of trust in peaceful routines. The horse that had spent months guarding deadly secrets needed time to learn that vigilance wasn't always necessary, and his slow relaxation became a measure of our successful adjustment to safety. Carlos's military experience with post-traumatic stress made him invaluable in recognizing signs that either Thunder or I were struggling with memories that threatened to overwhelm our attempts at building new lives. The news that Volkov had been captured in Eastern Europe brought both relief and renewed anxiety, as his arrest meant that the immediate threat to our safety had been neutralized, but his interrogation might reveal information that put us at risk from other criminal organizations. Agent Martinez assured us that our new identities were secure, and that Volkov's cooperation with federal investigators had actually strengthened the cases against his associates rather than exposing witnesses like ourselves to additional danger. Thunder seemed to sense the reduction in threat level, his behavior becoming more relaxed and playful as weeks passed without incident in our Montana refuge. The three of us began to believe that we might actually succeed in building genuine lives despite the artificial circumstances that had brought us together, and I started making plans that extended beyond simple survival to include happiness and purpose in our protected existence.